want to just talk very briefly about what the purpose of today is and what ultimately, I'd like to manage your expectations about when you leave here, if you're here for 1 hour, 2 hours, 6 hours, the whole thing, whatever it is, what ideally I would want to have us accomplish. And ultimately the goal is as follows. This goal is for us to walk out of here. Last year was a little bit different. Last year was all about Israel's legal rights, equipping us with the tools, the information, the facts and details, the history to be able to defend Israel, primarily Israel's legal rights to the land. This year, we're building upon that knowledge, and certainly Mark Vandermaas is going to talk about that. I think a lot of you have your handouts already. But this year, it's a very specific focus, and that focus is as follows: how to actually advocate for Israel. So we have a number of sessions. One is going to talk about how to lobby for Israel, how to fight for Israel on social media, how to have the facts, campus, across the board, how to be a trustworthy advocate. So again, the take-home deliverable I hope that we can all take away is ultimately practical tools that we can take away to defend Israel in whatever realm that we feel most comfortable. So first, of course, I'd like to welcome Richard Bass. Richard Bass has an...
Don't you have a microphone?
Not for this. We'll be setting it up afterwards. Richard actually is a high school teacher, so he projects much better than I do. So if you can't hear, just raise your hand or throw a spitball or whatever. I'm sure Richard is used to that. Just kidding, Richard, of course. So Richard's presentation, he has an initiative, Emmett Education, and basically Richard has an initiative now, Israel-Palestine for Critical Thinkers. And in a nutshell, and I'll certainly let Richard talk about it a little bit further, but it trains us to actually think critically and engage with, quote-unquote, the opponent's arguments. Because ultimately, the better we can defend Israel, only by ultimately understanding the opponent's arguments as well. So, of course, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Richard Bass.
Thank you, Rob. Can you guys hear me in the back? I don't know if I project better than Rob. I was quite impressed. So, just to add, a very quick introduction. I am an educator by trade. I'm a certified teacher in Ontario. I teach senior high school. My subject areas are primarily philosophy and law. Over the better part of the last 5 years, I've been involved in Israel education, and how that came to be was because of what I was seeing in the high school system, things that were being handed out, handouts like in world issues classes and world politics classes that were very one-sided, anti-Israel, and many of them not intentionally. I had colleagues who I knew weren't anti-Semitic, but they just didn't understand anything beyond what, let's say, they were getting in the media. And so it was impossible for them to filter if something was very one-sided or not one-sided. And I just decided, okay, well, we can complain about it or we can do something about it. And so I tried to do something about it as best as I could. And so I started an initiative that developed a course called a course in a book called Israel and World Relations. That in 2012 there were 60 students in North America enrolled in these courses in Jewish day schools. And then it grew to 120 students in 2014, and this year, 2014, 2015, we have over 1,200 students doing this 70-hour curriculum with a textbook. Thank you. But, the vast majority of students and people are not in Jewish day schools. Especially the vast majority of Jewish students are not in Jewish day schools. So how do we reach them? And hence there was this next project, which became Israel-Palestine for Critical Thinkers. So a lot of people have asked me about the title. And really the whole idea behind the title, the reasoning behind the title was, what can I do if I want to get people involved in the conversation who would potentially be turned off if it was obvious right from the beginning, if there was an agenda, which happens a lot. I need to find a title that's somewhat neutral. And the other reasoning was, I felt like, why should Palestine not be associated with Jewish history? Since, we were there for the majority of the time. It was called Palestine over any other faith. Well, arguably, we were there in terms of our initial history. And so I thought it would be important to seize back some of the terms of the debate. This has now become a YouTube series that launched. There's 7 videos now, an 8th one in the next couple of days. About 34 minutes that goes from the biblical era right up to 1947. It launched at the beginning of February, and up, I think as of last time I checked was late last week, there was close to 60,000 views on it, and we have 4,500 subscribers. So I hope nobody thinks I'm actually starting this way to self-aggrandize or tell you something great about what I've done. But I am going to ask you, obviously these programs need support, and at the very least, what I would ask you to do today is go online, watch the video series. If you can, please subscribe, send it out to 10 or 15,000 of your closest friends, and help me get this out there, okay? All right, so I have a couple of things that I want to do today. The talk is pretty much laid out for you in this handout. I thought I'd start just the first few minutes, give just some tools, critical thinking tools, so things that hopefully you can use, and then move past that to show these things in an example, and then move past that and talk about beyond the facts. Because if you get into this game and you have conversations, for many people, it's important, the facts are important, but then a lot of people say, okay, well, enough of the facts, what about X, right? What about the fact that there are still people there that we need an answer for? Okay, so facts go up to a certain point, and it's important to know them, but then after that, we have to realize that the conversation is going to end up at some point in time moving beyond the facts. And then I would like to leave some, like as much time as possible for interaction. One of the things I find in these talks is that you guys don't get to ask a lot of questions, and I think those become the most dynamic parts of these talks. We don't have a huge amount of time, but I would like to make sure that there's some time left at the end. So in order to do all those things, I'm sure you can appreciate, we're trying to focus on a couple of simple things that hopefully you can use. And then, without doing them, like you obviously can't do a full service to any of these things in 40 minutes, but we'll do the best we can. So my focus, I don't know if angle is the word I really wanted to choose, but the thing that has most impact for me is critical thinking, because it's neutral on some level, and most people that otherwise would have a lot of emotion involved in this conversation can have these conversations in a neutral, non-emotional way, in a reasonable way, if you approach them from a critical thinking perspective. So the first thing is, one of the things about critical thinking is you have to define your terms. So what does that mean exactly? So I just gave a simple, this is just my definition, and for me it's two components. It's both the desire and the skills or ability to analyze the justification, the grounds, the reasons supporting a belief, a claim, or an argument. So there's a lot in that sentence. But I don't just mean others' claims or beliefs, I mean ours as well. One of the things that surprised me when I decided to get into this whole game was I took a look at some of the claims the other side was making, and they seemed quite outrageous to me at the beginning, and then I thought to myself, okay, well, you preach critical thinking in your classes. Could you refute any of these claims? And it's really shocked me when I actually put them down on paper, and I'm going to show you an example, one today, that I sat there staring at the paper for hours and wondering, this claim seems crazy to me, like the claim that the Jewish people have no historical connection to the land of Israel, right? Or the Temple Mount area. I was like, come on, that's ridiculous. Of course we do. That's obvious. I was like, okay, so put down your reasons why you believe that claim is really specious, right? And I couldn't. I found that surprising. Okay, so it's these two skills. Number one, it has to come. There's got to be some kind of impetus to want to take these things on, and then there's a skill set that goes with that. So part of that is, we want to understand or appreciate the conditions under which, a claim should be believable or justifiable. And why am I starting off with critical thinking and an advocacy talk? Because I think there's a really close relationship between argumentation, not in the combative sense, right, but in the reasoning sense. Argumentation, another word for reasoning. There's a close relationship between advocacy and argumentation. So if advocacy by definition is a process by which you or a particular group, or perhaps a lobby group, aims to influence others, then you're going to likely be making claims or examining, exploring, analyzing, taking apart the claims that others are making. So one of the first skills that we need to do then is we need to understand language a little bit so that we can recognize or distinguish claims from other types of spoken or written communication. So here's some examples on the sheet, on your sheet here, of different types of the ways people speak or write. Okay, different types of sentence structures. So there's interrogatives, which are basically questions. And then there's imperatives, which are directives or commands. And as a teacher, I use that one a lot. Okay? I don't get a lot of response, but I use it a lot. And then there are expressive sentences, like those could be, emotional statements, or they could be ceremonial expressions. Oftentimes when I give a directive as a teacher, I get a very emotional or expressive statement in back. So claims fall under a different category than those. Basically what a claim is a type of sentence that asserts or denies something. And there are different types of claims. And hopefully what maybe you'll do after you leave this is you could be reading anything, a magazine article, and maybe you'll pay attention to the types of sentence structure that's going on. English is not so simple, as I tell students. I mean, some things that seem like they're questions, right, are actually claims. For example, somebody might say, "What are you, crazy?" All right, that's not really a question, right? It's really a statement, right? You're crazy, right? So, the English language is kind of funny that way, but if we understand the different types of sentence structures, we can help take a look at the various arguments that are being made and approach them, in a way that fits whatever the argument is. So let's talk for a second about different types of claims. So first are claims of fact. Okay, what do these do? These types of claims basically are claims that assert or deny something has happened, something is happening, something will happen. And so an example of that might be the Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup in 1967. Right? So anybody who follows the Maple Leafs probably wouldn't believe that claim because we're so traumatized at this point in time that we don't believe that could ever have possibly been true, that the Maple Leafs could have ever won a championship. Sorry to make a joke at their expense, but a lot of Leaf fans in here because nobody finds that funny, I guess. I was a Leaf fan. Okay. There are claims of value, which basically express whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, beautiful or ugly. For example, wow, that's a very beautiful sweater, right? Value claims, those that get a little bit tougher, right? Claims of fact, a lot of times you can challenge, right? There's information about that. Claims of value are a little bit more difficult. And the last one I'll talk about is claims of policy, which are claims where somebody makes a statement, the government of Canada should do X. The government of Israel should not give away territory to the Palestinian people. Right? These are various claims. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these in an example. If you flip on the back of your sheet, some of you have heard me speak before, may have seen I often play a clip of this guy. I literally could have picked hundreds of examples of things. This just happened to be one that had a number of claims in it, so I thought it would work well. We're not going to address all the claims here, but we'll take a look at the first one. This guy who is quoted, who is the object of the quote in this article, his name is Taisir Tamimi, and at the time that this was done, he was the second highest ranking Palestinian cleric in the Palestinian Authority. It is not only his position, this is the general position of the Palestinian Authority, of Abbas, their leadership, their academics. And so what are some of the things he says? The Jewish temples never existed, and the Jews have no historic connection to Jerusalem, declared Chief Palestinian Justice Sheikh Taisir Tamimi today. Okay, so according to Tamimi, these are claims of fact, right? They deny something that happened in the past, right? No temples, no historic connection. Jerusalem is an Arab and Islamic city, and it has always been so. Okay? Another claim, a claim of fact of what has been and is still today. There is no Jewish connection to Israel before the Jews invaded in the 1880s. Okay, so you get the point. These would fall under claims of fact. What would, for example, be a value type of claim mixed with a fact claim would be the second quote, right? Jewish rabbis, all Jewish rabbis and extremist organizations, and Netanyahu are lying when they state Jerusalem is a historical city. Actually, that's probably more of a factual claim. See if there are any values claims in here. Okay, off the top of my head, I can't see anything, but you could see there's obviously are bias laden. So here's some examples of some facts. So what you would want to do, in my opinion, once you understand you're dealing with a factual claim, is to take a look at it and then break it down. And so this was the first claim there I was telling you just a few minutes ago, that once I started to get interested in this subject, this happened to be the claim that really got me on the road. I looked at it and I thought, come on, that's ridiculous. I mean, we have no historical connection to Jerusalem. I mean, is this guy serious? I mean, you know that we've been excavating since 1967 and there hasn't been one single thing that has been dug up that could prove our connection to this site? And so I started to think about it. And, you know, it was really quite humbling that I honestly could not put anything down on paper. Okay, so, you know, for a while I might have thought, well, maybe it's just me. And then, you know, once I started to do some work in this area and started to speak at different colleges and universities and different high schools, I'd go around and I'd have a room like this, sometimes with in this particular case, majority Jewish audience. But on campuses would still be a majority, maybe a little bit less of Jewish audience, and there might be 150 students in the room, some of which with a pedigree Jewish day school education. This is nothing against Jewish day schools. I'm just saying this is what was it. And I would put this claim out there. And I would ask anybody, if I would ask people, do they believe this is true? And nobody would really raise their hands. And then I would say, how many people feel that they could refute the claim? So a few people would put their hand up, a few students in the room, maybe half a dozen, and then I would ask them, okay, so please, I mean, what are the grounds for your believing that this is false, or your grounds for believing that our claim is true? And so, you know, I'd get all kinds of different answers, but for the most part, nothing really grounded. I remember one particular talk I did at the University of Western Ontario, where one of the organizers at the university who brought me to speak, it was an Israel on Campus group, put his hand up and said, well, that's ridiculous. There are mountains and mountains of evidence, reams of evidence. And I said, okay, well, just give me one example of a piece of evidence that would refute this claim. He said, well, it's just too much. And I said, well, I only need one example. Just give me one example. And he was like, I don't know. Right? So the thousands and thousands and thousands of times that I've people and audiences that I've given this talk to, I could tell you that I probably only had maybe a dozen, and an audience like this maybe get a little bit more, of real grounded responses as to why we should believe there's a historical connection. I'm just going to ask Gary to just hold on for a second because I know it's not true. So I'm going to give I'll give you a little bit of an answer now for anybody who wants one. I'll do it quickly. But the first thing was, okay, well, never mind, you know, because what's going to happen, I know what's going to happen. The first thing that's going to happen is if I start presenting just facts right away, it's going to just become a war of facts. So what I want to do, and I do this with a lot of the topics, it doesn't matter whether it's the Gaza war or any other topic, and this is how I do I would call it education, but we can call it advocacy for today's purposes, is that the first thing that, you know, I usually do is start with a question. And my question with this is, okay, well, what counts as history? Because really, the first thing you've got to get, in my opinion, if you're going to do advocacy in a way that becomes a conversation and not a fight, right, is you've got to get a lot of yeses. And maybe there are people who are in this room who are really good business people, and maybe they know a lot more about negotiating than I do. But it seems like to me that if you're just dealing with no's, no's, no's all the time, there's never going to be a meeting of the minds, right? So I really wanted to first find out, is there any common ground on what I can agree with somebody on what counts as history? So what I did is I figured out, okay, what are some of the things that all of us are prepared to accept in support of a historical claim? And so because I teach high school law, one of the things I started with was, okay, what happens, let's say, during a court of law? Because everything is pretty much a historical claim there that you're trying to assess, right? And we know that legal systems have to be based on something, because it never really happens where the guy's sitting in the courtroom and he says, look, Your Honor, he's stealing my lawnmower right now as we speak, right? What happens is, it doesn't matter, I think, whether it's criminal or civil case, is both parties are presenting something, a story about what happened in the past, and it's whoever has the more believable story, right, the stronger grounds to support their claim carries the day. And we know that there are things that courts of law, accept based on past. So one of those things, for example, is personal observation. Well, probably not a lot of people would have seen the temple that are still alive today, okay? But it just so happens that there are historians who wrote about that, like Josephus, who give eyewitness accounts of what happened back in ancient Jerusalem. He was a general, he fought against the Romans. He saw the whole thing unfold right before his eyes, and he wrote about it. So somebody might say, okay, yeah, but that's like 2,000 years ago, right? I mean, what other evidence have you got? Okay, so, there are obviously tangible objects. I mean, these stones must have come from somewhere. I mean, when was this site built otherwise? According to the Islamic story, I mean, right now, Taisir Tamimi's story may not be the Islamic story, because not all Muslims believe this, right? According to Tamimi's story, this would have just appeared at some point in time in history, but he doesn't say when or how it came to be, right? And so I just went through various sources of corroborating evidence. Another tangible object, for example, would be the Arch of Titus. Right? Sometimes when I did talks, students would say, well, what about the Arch of Titus? Right? And I would say, okay, that's a good one. What about it? Why does that support our claim? And then the conversation would stop, because they didn't really know why the Arch of Titus would be something that would actually be evidence that are grounds for why we believe we have a historical connection there. How many people are familiar with the Arch of Titus? Excellent. So I don't really need to go into a lot of detail about it. It's an artifact in Rome, right? Engraved on the inside of the arch is, people have, I'm sure, seen this, most people here, is a picture, or the engraving actually depicts what most Jews recognize as a menorah. But for me, I needed more, right? So, well, why should I believe that that particular artifact should be associated with Judaism and the temple? And so it just so happens that if you actually go into our Torah, like in the book of Shemot, right, you'll actually see, I don't know chapter and verse, but there's a rabbi here. So you'll actually see, I'll give it to you if you want. Normally when I do this presentation on the screen, I actually have it. But I mean, you'll actually see the references to the temple menorah, the description of it, and just by coincidence, it happens to be pretty much identical to the artifact that's engraved in the Arch of Titus, which is Roman history, not Jewish history, going back 2,000 years. Okay, so I don't want to belabor this. I mean, I know really the point of bringing this up wasn't to say that this is a claim that is really problematic for us to defend. It's simply to point out that no matter what topic you're looking at, the first thing you want to do is to be able to separate out the claims, try and distinguish what types of claims they are, right? Factual claims are somewhat easier to deal with, although those also often take a lot of work, right, to build a compelling case on the other side. But to find some common ground when you're talking to another person, first, before you get into the conversation about the facts, about what they're prepared to accept as a starting ground, right? So I mentioned things like personal observation, intangible objects, and documents. This guy, I don't think, is in a position, and anybody arguing this kind of position like him would care whether, I mean, we're not going to have the same opinion of what counts as history. Right? If you saw a couple of weeks ago what happened, I believe it was in Iraq, was it in Mosul or something like that, the destruction of the artifact in the museum? There are people in the world who don't hold the same appreciation for history unless it corroborates only their view. Right? So you're not going to be in agreement there. Okay. So that sort of brings me to my next point. Right, so the first thing was, what are some tools? The tools are, if you're going to approach this from a critical thinking perspective, understand that you can analyze things in terms of language and then break things into different types of claims. And then, but you're going to get to a certain point when you get to not that you'd want to have a conversation with a person coming from this particular point of view, but there is going to be a point at which these facts then just end up banging heads. And as numerous people have said to me, for example, we might have something like the Gaza war that we're talking about. And so, for me, if something like that comes up, and the person might I'm sure you've heard these arguments before. Well, why is Israel committing all these atrocities in Gaza? Why are they killing innocent civilians? Thanks so much. And for me, this is where things get beyond the facts, right? Because before you can really have a conversation on that level about the facts, the person, in my opinion, is now presenting, to say it politely, it could be even more aggressive than that. Before you can even really get to a point, if you want to have a dialogue, I think you've got to bring it back to a point where it starts where you can at least find some agreement on something. And so I'll give you an example of how I would approach, let's say, the Gaza thing. So the first example I gave you is how I'd approach the historical thing, by having a conversation like, what counts as history for you? I would say to a person, right? And then, once they're open to that, then we can have a conversation about the history. Because we're now in a point of agreement on what should count as facts of history, right? Same thing with let's say, a more contemporary thing like the Gaza war. And the question there might be, for example, well, do you think that there is ever a time when war is justified? Because when I do these kinds of topics in my philosophy class, there are students who don't think that there's ever a time for war. And I want to know, before I get into a whole factual conversation about somebody, if they don't think that there's ever a time that somebody should be going to war, then it really isn't about Israel. It's just about war. And then there's no point in having a conversation, because all I need to say to them is, okay, so I get it. Now, I might have a different conversation. So, for example, if there was a very hostile force who had a very different view of how society should be run, was attacking the society that you live in, you would be okay with just, having them take over. You wouldn't fight back. If the person says yes, then what am I going to have a conversation about? It's done, right? And I have a couple of students who hold that, right? But if the person says, no, of course I believe there's a time when a nation state or a people can defend themselves. Okay, so when is that? Under what conditions does that happen? What does that look like? Because then they'll pretty much start to make the argument for me. All I have to do is then fill in some of the pieces, right? Of course, I need to know my subject, right? But the first thing is to find out where the person's coming from. Right? Forget the facts. The facts are like down the road. There's something behind that that's coming first. And why I actually bring this up is because many people who raise their hands in talks that I give, or come to me afterwards, or write me emails. A lot of what's bothering them is the context in which these conversations are happening. Even though, this Taisir Tamimi guy may be upsetting, right, and what he's saying could be infuriating even, offensive potentially. We kind of expect it from certain places. Where it gets to be really uncomfortable, like in my life where it's become really uncomfortable, is if I happen to be dating someone. Obviously, I'm married now. This is a conversation from a long time ago, so please, I don't want anybody to get any ideas, right? Right? But, when it comes at the water cooler, or in colleagues who I really like, and a comment like that comes up, coworkers, or at a family dinner, with a cousin I haven't seen for a long time, it's like, what? What did you just say? Or there was a clip on Facebook about, I think, something just happened a couple of days ago about a response that happened in Australia that was appalling to me. Those are the things that are tough, is when it's people that you have a relationship with. Well, I don't have a relationship with the person in Australia, but with people who are close to you, family, friends, co-workers. And a lot of us find ourselves in that position, right? Because people only get a chance to hear what the media has to say. They've been inundated with stuff for years and years, and then you're kind of stuck, as I've had a couple of people point out. This has happened to me on numerous occasions where people have come up to me either in Shul or in the course of my work and said, I need your help. A few weeks ago, I happened to be sitting at a dinner party, and the person at the dinner party, there were 12 people around, and the person started talking this and this and this and this about Israel, and I had no idea what to say. Right? That's where it gets tough. Okay, so here's for me maybe just what I would do, right? And I think that, you obviously have to weigh out all of these situations just as unique, and I can't give you one strategy for everyone. You're going to have to feel them out as they come up. I don't know the personality that you could potentially dealing with. But this is how, if I was going to respond, how I would respond. And I would not necessarily respond by countering fact with fact, right? I would start with a question. Right? So I basically said that there are different types of sentence structures, right? Claims assert or deny things, right? I would not be interested in coming right into a conversation where somebody has just made an assertion or a denial, some kind of a claim, right? That I am then going to come to bat with another kind of claim, right? And it happens a lot of times in the talks that I give. When sometimes the focus goes from me, or I've seen it when other people speak, out into the audience, and it just becomes a ping pong match of who can out-fact the next person, as if somehow whoever's holding the last fact wins the game. It never works like that. All right? The only way it works is, in my opinion, is if you can get the person at some point in time, and it probably won't be right there in front of you, okay, to think about some of the things that they have come to believe, and to understand that there is a difference between belief and truth. Okay? But people won't necessarily jump on that because they have ego, but I don't mean it in the condescending sense. We all have our own pride, and the Chinese, I think, say save face, all right? And there is emotional glue that usually attaches people to a position, and you need to give people time to move from wherever they are to whatever a different place is if they're open to doing so, right? So it's important, I think, to start with questions and then have the person at the end of the day ideally ask you the questions. So it becomes a question and answer session instead of fact against fact. Okay? This is at least my strategy. I found it successful. Even in places, and I told you about these university talks, that University of Western Ontario talk, I had 20 students sitting in, maybe it was a dozen, maybe I'm exaggerating, the story's getting better as I go along. There were 75 Islamic student unions, right? In 5 years, half the university showed up to that talk, and they were pro, right? Okay. So there were for sure a dozen. Right? With the keffiyehs and the red the pro-Palestinian garb, the red T-shirts, and the head of the Islamic Students Association, but they all sat there for an hour and a half. The talk was only supposed to be 45 minutes, right? And so I'm not saying that I've discovered some secret to harmony in the world, because I haven't, right? But I've just found this strategy actually allows for a better chance at a dialogue, and not the idea, because if it's a fact against fact, I can tell you based on my experience, mostly on what I've seen, because I don't generally get involved in these kinds of conversations anymore, it's a no-win situation, right, in my opinion. And all it really often does is turn off the real people that you want to hear, which is not the person you're having a conversation with, but the 12 other eyes and ears that are listening to the whole thing that are open. Okay? So you want to make sure to understand it's not really your conversation against that person. Oftentimes it's your conversation against everybody else that's listening. Okay? Okay. Let's see if there's anything else I want to do. I think I want to take maybe just to have some time to take a couple of questions. So let me just give 2 seconds to sum up what I just said, and then we'll move on. Okay? For me, advocacy first needs to be ideally a critical thinking approach first. Okay? Not to take the emotion out of it, but to make it quite neutral. To understand, to recognize a claim from the different types of claim, a factual claim from values claims, because you have to approach them differently. Find a way to ask a question that will help you understand where that person is coming from, aside from just the fact, okay, and where they hold. And then to move beyond the facts and hopefully move into a question and answer dialogue, which makes it a little bit easier to communicate if you're going to advocate. Of course, I'm not suggesting that this is a strategy all the time, right? Like in a newspaper, if somebody makes a claim and you're going to write an op-ed piece, there's not going to be a dialogue back and forth. So I'm really primarily talking about relationships where you're having these conversations with people that matter, right? Because at a university, if it's going to be a shut-in, I don't really care to be in those kinds of circumstances anyway. I don't, for me, they're not necessarily productive, but I know that they have to be had sometimes, okay? All right, so please.
All right, okay. One of the things you said, well, a lot of things you said resonated, but just recently you said that sometimes it's not the person you're talking to, but the other people who have open minds that are listening. And it reminded me of something. I have these interactions with people on Facebook, and a lot of what you said will make it easier sometimes. But what I found out later on is people will see me in person and say, I didn't want to say anything. I don't want people to know I'm listening. But I really learned a lot from what you said, and you know, and it keeps me going sometimes, because you wonder, you know, fact for fact, you can't win. It's like it's something, you know, the mental illness on the other side you feel, but other people are listening, and you know, it's not going to change the world, but at least I feel like I'm not spitting against the wind.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, and there's an emotional attachment. We all have some emotional attachments to some of where these beliefs come from, and for some people they run quite deep. And the question is to find out where this place is coming from. For example, is this a human rights issue for the person, right? Then have the conversation on a human rights dimension, right? In which case now, I mean, then you have at least you understand your strategy. And because Israel, we know there are lots of points that you could discuss with somebody about Israel in terms of their sensitivity to human rights and so on and so forth. I mean, whatever. There is no one recipe for dealing with these things. I'm just sort of providing a tool, but I appreciate your feedback. You do have to feel it out, and it is important to get some facts into the story here and there, but just to understand how and when that could happen.
Would you count that the accounts in the Bible and Tanakh as evidence of our temple? And because they're citing, like Tamimi is citing traditions in Islam. So it seems like therefore he would accept, I personally think he would accept that as evidence if we're citing our religious sources. So do you use those as evidence? And also I'm curious how far you got with the Islamic students that were sitting in that room, where they moved from.
Okay, so the comment, I don't know if people get here in the back, was, you'll just correct me if I'm right? The comments was basically broken into two things. Do I consider the Tanakh, like our Torah, as having any valid grounds in these conversations, as evidence in these conversations? Number one. And the second question was, how did things end up going with the Islamic students? I'm still standing, so they didn't go too bad. So no, I'll deal with the first question first. Yes, I consider stuff in the Torah to be potential for evidence if there's extra biblical sources or tangible extra biblical evidence to back it up. It's not because I don't believe the Torah is true, but most of the people that I have a conversation with could care less about the Bible as evidence-based, and they would think that I'm like a fanatic coming from somewhere if that was the only source. But there are extra biblical things that corroborate the historical elements of the Torah. Torah is not a history book. We all know that, right? But there are historical elements in it. Those just need to be corroborated by extra biblical things. For example, the writings of a historian that have survived, the artifacts like seals or diplomatic correspondence from ancient ancient civilizations like the El Armana letters, or different inscriptions on steles like the Kirk monolith, or the Edict of Cyrus, right? I mean, we can't prove every single thing that happened. Like we don't have Abraham's phone bill, right? Or his credit card, right? But we do have things that went on, in Abraham's time that are consistent with what went on in the biblical era. And as you get further along, we have more tangible evidence. So when I have things like that start to piece together the story, then yes, I use them. Like the Arch of Titus, which, to me, seems like quite a slam dunk, about the events that went on in the destruction of the Second Temple era, right? And which takes us back 2,000 years anyway. The second question is what happened with the Islamic students. I actually think it went quite well. After the talk, the head of the Islamic Students Association came down, and he's very polite. And once he came down, this is what I was saying, there were 15 other students at least that gathered, and actually that I'm not exaggerating, I think I'm underestimating. We're all standing around, and one of them told me afterwards, we just wanted to hear what you were saying to this guy, right? His name was Muhammad, just so happens, and he was very respectful to me, very deferential. But he said to me, I don't really understand the whole issue and where you're coming from. He goes, I also don't understand what the whole thing is with I don't know why he brought this up. But first he said, Israel has a siege on Gaza. It's a complete blockade. First he introduced himself and said he was from Gaza originally, and he said there's a blockade, nobody can get in or out. And I said, well, how did you get here, right? But it wasn't to poke fun at him, but he said, okay, so I admit there was some movement back and forth, right? Because again, it's a factual claim, so I just want to know here. Well, you're a fact, and you're standing. Okay, so the next thing was he said, I think his next comment was, just so you know, and I think he was just trying to educate me. The Quran is very friendly, to the Jewish people. Really talks that they're protected people. And so I had prefaced my talk at the University of Western by basically saying, look, before we start to go down any kind of a path, I want to make sure that we're going to have a contract with each other, that we're going to try and make this a talk about holistic truth, not just little pieces of truth, right? It has to be the whole picture. So I said to him, well, okay, I could see how you could say that about certain verses of the Quran, right? How it does talk about the Jewish people as people of the book. But then I said to him, Muhammad, but what about the verse that comes right after that usually, or within a couple of verses after that? And he said, well, I don't know what you mean. And I said, well, have you read the Quran? And he said, no. And I said, well, you know what? I have a bunch of sources on my computer, and I pulled them up for him, and I went through them because I had put them side by side, all the verses that he was talking about and all the verses that I was talking about. I said, so, how do you explain these? Now, I never brought up the Quran. I don't bring up Islam in my talks, generally, a university, because at that point in time, it didn't go anywhere. It wasn't the topic that we were looking at. But he said to me, he looked at me and he said, oh, wow, that's interesting. He said, can you send that to me? And I said, with pleasure. You're welcome to check the sources out yourself. Now, I know I had a good source because the Quran I used was the most widely read English version in the world, translated by a guy who was an eminent scholar.
What's the name of it?
The author's name is Yusuf Ali. He's not alive anymore, and it has commentary on the bottom. And since we're on the topic, is Rob here? How much time do I have? Okay. Oh, good. Okay. So I appreciate everybody still. I'll thank everybody in advance for staying for my 6-hour talk. Hold on. I'll get you 1 sec. I'm just going to finish with this. Since we're on the topic of the Quran, one of the things that's interesting to note in Surah 17, which is the surah in the Quran which deals with Muhammad's night journey. Which is, for those people who aren't familiar, according to Islam, and Dr. Kadar had a great talk about this a number of weeks ago, so I'm just going to give the politically correct version. So according to Islamic theology, they consider the Temple Mount area the place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven on a night journey, right? Where he then had a conversation with all the famous prophets from Judaism and Judaism and Christianity, like Moses and Jesus. It must have been quite an event. Not to make fun of it, but I didn't mean it that way. Heaven forbid. So that Surah 17, Yusuf Ali's commentary on Surah 17, he talks about a word which he says in Arabic refers to twice or 2 occasions, and his commentary about that 2 occasions says the 2 occasions in Arabic generally probably refer to the destruction of the temple, Solomon's temple by Titus, right, in 70, and the destruction by the Babylonians in the first in 586. So, it's interesting because before all this silliness started in the early part of the 20th century, Islam had never, not to my understanding, in any time in their history made a claim that the Jewish people don't have a connection to that place, and that if anything, that they knew that, In fact, many Muslim, not many, there are Muslim clerics in the world, like Sheikh Palazzi, the Italian community, who actually hold that the Islam's position is that Israel belongs to the Jewish people, and it's actually counter to Islamic thinking and Islamic theology to think otherwise. So it's interesting, the sources. But anyway, Surah 17. Okay, so maybe I'll take a couple more and then, please, yeah.
I just want to tell you about it. You said the conversation came up informal at the table with the family, and there are some assertions placed and denials, and you answer with a question. And I was prepared to ask for what type of question. I'm kind of stuck in a void.
Depends on the statement, right? I mean, the question has to fit the statement. So, for example, I'll give you a common one. Okay? The Palestinian people are the indigenous or native people of the land. This is what the person said. You go back, right? Jews didn't show up. The Israelite invasion happened. When the Israelite invasion happened in the latter part of the 13th century, before the Common Era, there was already there were a bunch of people there, right? They were Canaanites and Philistines, right? And those are the Palestinians. Those are the indigenous people. You took the land from them then, right? And now they're being robbed again. They are the indigenous population. So there's an example, right? So you might say, okay, so what are you going to answer to that? Right? Right? I'll just give you a quick one, because if you want, I'll do a plug for the video series afterwards where you can get more history, or you can write me. I'll leave my contact information anyone wants, and I'll give you a much longer answer to this, right? But a quick question might be, okay, well that's an interesting position, right? What makes you believe that? What makes you believe that even if what you're saying is true, where is the history that goes from that point till now? Help me understand. Maybe it's a Socratic position. Help me understand, right? If they're the indigenous people, what is the history from then till now, right? And it will be virtually impossible, right? I would say for 99.999% of the people, unless they're connecting it to Jewish history, right, to be able to draw some kind of chain of transmission or tradition through history, right, that proves that there was an indigenous people called the Palestinian going throughout history. It just doesn't exist, right? So all you can do is start with a question. Before you dispute the facts, they weren't the indigenous people, there were other people there before, right? Because it's true there were other people there before that. I mean, we know that, right? It's part of our tradition that says that. I mean, look at the Torah. We know what the land was called then. We know that there were Amorites and Moabites, or whatever the different 7 kings were, the city-states, right? We understand, right? But where are those people, right? And then where's their chain? The people with the strongest and only real chain of transmission that can be marked through millennia are the Jewish people. I mean, that's just the facts, right? I mean, but find out first from the person why they hold where they hold. Where is the evidence that would support that claim that there was a people there that had a chain of transmission or history through there? And then the other thing is, why then they believe that the people today are connected to those people back then, right? Where's the grounds for that claim? Because if you understand the history, I mean, the Philistines weren't reputed to have shown up till after the Israelite invasion. The Philistines are a sea people. So, one of the things that I always find interesting, and not that I would make this argument to somebody unless there was already some common ground, but the word Arab has its origin in Arava or Araba, the Hebrew words and the Arabic words, right? That word is desert, right? Desert people, right? So, if the Philistines are a sea people, and everybody knows they're a sea people, right? Then how are the Arab people today, the Palestinians, how could they be associated with the sea people? Are you desert people or are you sea people? Because the last time I checked, they were 2 very different geographical type of areas, right? One came from the Aegean, the other came from the deserts of Syria and Saudi Arabia, right? So, But again, you have to have these conversations. You have to judge the person you're sitting next to and know your story, know your. But that's an example of an idea of why you think that there's a chain of transmission, because I could break it in 2 seconds. I mean, the origin of the name Palestine is from Philistines, right? It was a Romanized name called Syria-Palestina. Okay, which didn't happen until after the destruction of the this is the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132. So if the name doesn't appear in history until then, right, and it's based on a people called the Philistines who are sea people, why are we associating this group of Arab people who consider themselves Arab and desert people? Where's the repair for this whole story? But that's a very quick. All right, I know we have time for one more. I think it would. Yeah.
In your experience, calling the hypocrisy of your opponent, is that a productive strategy?
Sorry, I didn't catch it.
Calling out the hypocrisy of your opponent, is that a productive strategy? And if it is, what's the best way to apply it?
So the question was, is calling out the hypocrisy of my opponent my strategy? So I want to say this in the most respectful way, but I don't approach. I would only approach a conversation like that if, let's say, I'm like I am now on no sleep and sick, right? I would think, right? But I don't look at people like that. I'm an ex-football coach, so if it needs to be a battle, then I'm fine with that, right? But most of the time, the people I'm dealing with, in my experience, I found I can talk to. Thank heavens I haven't met with a lot of hostility in my approach, and I would not approach it. I don't approach people. I don't look at people like that. The first thing is I look at somebody as, number one, let me understand where you're coming from first. Because, I don't know what information you've been exposed to. Maybe that person has never once been exposed to the truth, and they haven't even made a free-willed, informed choice about where they're holding, right? They didn't necessarily choose the information they were going to filter off that got into their brain. If I wasn't, let's say, Jewish, right, or if I didn't have my background and would I be in exactly the same headspace as they am? Maybe. So I don't necessarily look at them as hypocrites, but maybe just trying to understand where are you coming from. Now, if in their answer they basically are showing me every sign that they're an anti-Semite, right, and that they're hostile only because they're prejudiced, all right. So one of two things is going to, the conversation's going to end because I'm not interested in wasting my time. I mean, there's no point to it, right? I'm not going to ever get that person to open their mind up from where they're holding right now, and I'm not interested in trying, right? Some people are just, for me, until you can move back a little bit, I don't really see the point, right? And you could tell most of the time, right, whether somebody's open. And I still think it's a smaller majority, but they exist. So I was going to say, either the conversation ends or we're going to end up in a fist fight, one of the two. I don't know, but and hopefully it's a guy. No, but no, I wouldn't approach the conversation. I would approach the conversation like I'm dealing with a reasonable person first, and give them the benefit of the doubt that if we start to have a conversation, I ask questions that they're not necessarily hostile, that they just maybe don't know. And so far, I've been pretty fortunate, even in conversations with pro-Palestinian groups that have sat in the audience, and I've seen what they've done to other speakers, right? I mean, they stand up with their mouths taped and their defiance, and you've got to get the security guards, and, I just think there are other strategies that allow for an opportunity to get your point across, so I would approach it differently. But again, you've got to assess what's in front of you. Okay, I wish we had a lot more time. So if I may, if you'll allow me, I just want to let people know that if you're interested, okay, didn't come here to do it, but if you're interested, Israel-Palestine for Critical Thinkers on YouTube is the name of the series. Please go to the channel and subscribe. You can find us. You can find me on liveforcriticalthinkers.com. There is a resource that goes through a whole bunch of different stuff, full color, and also the textbook that's being used called Israel and World Relations. If you're interested, I think there'll be some copies available. Or you can find me at info at forcriticalthinkers.com at any time in the future. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I hope you got something out of it.